Okay, good morning everyone. Okay, so in my part I'm going to tackle three main points: the significance of accent when the acquisition of a foreign accent is better acquired, cognitive considerations, what are the cognitive factors that are involved in the acquisition of a language, and affective considerations, is there any explanation to the acquisition of language in the affective sides of human beings? Okay, here we start. Okay, so the significance of accent. So actually the accent meant here is the foreign accent or the accent of a foreign language. So as we know, the articulation as a process involves the use of the organs of speech. These organs of speech or speech muscles gradually develop, and control of some complex sounds in certain languages is sometimes not achieved until after age 5. And a typical example here is the sounds, for example, L and R in English. So native speakers of English do not have a control over these two complex sounds until they reach the age of 5. Most of the evidence indicates that persons beyond the age of puberty do not acquire authentic pronunciation or native speaker pronunciation of the second language. Here we refer to critical period hypothesis. That is to say that individuals after the phase of puberty could not successfully acquire the accent of a second or a foreign language. But of course, there are exceptions, and to refute this hypothesis, there have been some studies to contradict Scoville-Strong CPH or critical period hypothesis, such as Neufeld's study.
So you notice already the difference between the previous last concept on the topological evidence, which is talking about perfection, perfect, okay, so you're speaking a second or maybe more than language perfectly, okay? And this one which says that there is a critical period, which means that we can never reach an accent in a perfect way. Differences, okay?
Yeah.
But what we can understand here is that this is maybe the normal way of life, of learning and how things go in the first and second language acquisition, by opposition to the previous anthropological evidence, which is kind of exceptional,
yes.
Okay, because it has to do with the way of life of those people, so it's kind of exceptional.
Okay.
That's how you can make the relationship between these different theories. Okay.
Okay, so in his study, Neufeld undertook actually a set of studies to determine to what extent adults could approximate native speaker accent in second language never before encountered. That is to say that the purpose of Neufeld or the study of or the experiment of Neufeld is to discover whether or not adults could approximate native speaker accent. So in his experiment, 20 adult native speakers were taught to imitate 10 utterances in Japanese and in Chinese. Native speaking Japanese and Chinese judges listened to the taped imitations and judged these to have been produced by native speakers. So the result of the experiment conducted by Neufeld, it refutes the principle of critical period hypothesis and demonstrates that even adults could approximate native speaker accent. So what we can conclude from this experiment is that available evidence does not consistently support the hypothesis that younger second language learners are globally more efficient and successful than older learners. That is to say that even though younger learners are better than adult learners in terms of the acquisition of language, they are just better at the level of accent. However, adults are better in terms of accuracy, fluency, and communication, and so on. Therefore, we are left with powerful evidence of a critical period for accent, but for accent only. And great accent only does not mean that the learner is a successful second language learner. So the accent is not the only criterion for a successful second language acquisition. However, there are other factors, as I said before, like accuracy, communication, fluency, and so on. So even though poor at accent, one can have excellent and fluent control of a second language. So an individual may be, for example, poor at accent of a second language, but he may have an excellent control over this language that may exceed the control that native speakers have. And I think that a typical example here is the case of the King Hassan II, who was very fluent in speaking French, even better than native speaker of this language. So this principle is referred to as Arnold Schwarzenegger effect. It is because
Maybe because Arnold Schwarzenegger going to speak Spain, it doesn't sound like he's an American. And like he's a native speaker, but he speaks well.
yes, this is the irony.
Because
His accent doesn't reflect
it's
native.
not really American. It doesn't look sound American. Yeah, but he speaks fluently.
Yeah. Okay, it is.
Those beginnings, because I think when it comes to acquired accent, I think it's far from the they can sustain that accent more than 50 minutes. You can use for 10 minutes, but later on, means unconsciously switch you.
So that's why this is the purpose here. It shows that accent is really difficult to master perfectly. Okay? This is the only area where the critical period hypothesis finds solid evidence. Okay? In relation to accent. But you can find people speaking fluently or they're forgetting about accent. That's what
Yes.
we're looking here at this effect called Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Okay, so the second factor to consider in the acquisition of language is cognitive considerations. So John Piaget outlined the course of intellectual development in a child through various stages. I think we are all familiar with these stages, okay? Okay, the first one is sensorimotor stage from birth to 2 years, pre-operational stage from 2 to 7, concrete operational stage from 7 to 11, and finally formal operational stage from 11 to 16 years, okay? So just a brief description of the main characteristics of each stage. Sensorimotor stage, so it is the first stage in cognitive development, as mentioned or claimed by Piaget. So during this stage, infants construct an understanding of the world by coordinating sensory experiences with motor actions. Sensory experiences like, for example, hearing and seeing, and motor actions like touching. Pre-operational stage, so in this or at this stage, language development is one of the hallmarks of this period. So children in this stage do not yet understand concrete logic, and they cannot mentally manipulate information. And at this stage, egocentrism and animism are among the constraints or limitations of this stage. So by egocentrism, we mean that children cannot, for example, take the point of view of others. And by animism is that children believe that objects have lifelike quality and they are capable of action. So a child, for example, can say, the sidewalk made me fall down. And we have concrete operational stage, which is characterized by the use of operations. Logical reasoning replaces intuitive reasoning, but only in concrete situations, while abstract situations or abstract problems go unsolved. Finally, we have formal operational stage. During this time, people develop the ability to think about abstract concepts. Skills such as logical thought, deductive reasoning, and systematic planning also emerge during this stage. Okay, so from this description of these stages, we can conclude that critical stage concerning second language acquisition appears to occur at puberty, means between the age of 11 to 12. So it is at this phase when persons become able to think abstractly and they develop their formal thinking and reasoning. So, to connect Piaget's stages of development with critical period arguments, Possible noted that adults learning a second language could profit from certain grammatical explanations and deductive thinking. So, because adults are able to think in more abstract way, and because they developed the formal and formal and abstract thinking, they benefit from the explanations of grammatical structure, which is something abstract, and on the other hand, something that children could not benefit from. But children do learn second language well without these benefits. The question is how? So it's simply because young children are generally not aware. There is something else. Okay. Young children are generally not aware that they are acquiring a second language, unlike adults who are aware of their learning. That is to say that children acquire the second language in the same way in which they acquire their mother tongue, spontaneously, unconsciously, and so on. So they learn this language as a whole. They are not exposed to grammatical, for example, structures, functions, and so on. Okay, so the question to ask here is it possible that a language learner who is too consciously aware of what he or she is doing will have difficulty in learning the second language? In other words, can we see that adults who are aware of their learning will have difficulties in the acquisition of the second language? So the answer to this question is no, because there were evidences of successful adult second language learners. Means that even if adults are aware of their learning, they better acquire the second language. So Robert De Keyser 2000 said that somewhere between the age of 6, 7 and 16, 17, everybody loses the mental equipment required for the implicit induction of the abstract patterns underlying a human language, and the critical period really deserves its name. So the implication of this quote is that at a certain age, between 6 to 17, individuals lose their ability to learn implicitly, and therefore we can talk about the critical period, of course, according to Robert De Keyser.
So before we go on, you get it. So this is the summary, the main point of all this. Can you rephrase that?
Concerning the last point here, that says that people usually tend to acquire language between the age of 6 to 7 till 16 and 17.
It's not acquisition, they lose.
Yes?
Somewhere between the age of 6, 7 and 16, 17, everybody loses. It's not acquisition.
Yes, which means that they know after this age, they are no longer able to acquire a certain language.
Just implicitly. Okay, they acquire it explicitly. For example, adult.
Okay. But what can I say, for example, about immigrants, people who immigrate to other countries at a certain age, at 20 or 30, okay? When they go to a certain country, they acquire that language implicitly, not explicitly. No, implicitly.
Yes, of course. It is.
But see, now, what is to what extent they are successful in learning that language? We know immigrants when they speak French, for example.
Yes.
Okay, even the Moroccan immigrants who participated in the Second World War, for example, when they speak, there's a commentary when they show in they will speak in a horrible language. They say, for example, in La Première Guerre mondiale, this is how
What was the objective of learning a language? Yeah, I think that the objective of learning a certain language is to acquire that communicative competence.
Yes, I agree with you, Gladys, and of course this is debatable. And as we said before, there are some who said that we can say that there is existence of critical period hypothesis, and there are others who say that this doesn't exist, and it is debatable. And you are right to be either for or against. Yeah.
Yes, I think the immigrants, they don't acquire they learn it because this is the very simple thing that they think about is how can I survive? So they know they already have knowledge about asking for their basic need. So they think about how am I going to learn this? So they are conscious about what they are going to learn. So they ask, they know, they observe, then they learn. I don't think they acquire.
What is the difference between acquire and learn?
When you learn your attention, you know that something is taking place. When you acquire,
So we talk about learning a second language.
What is learning?
When you learn someone the rules of the language, conscious and position when you learn something unconscious.
That's not the reason, conscious and conscious, okay? Conscious doing what? Okay, so it has to do more with the rules. Learning, we are dealing with the rules, activities, and teacher, and so on. But for acquiring, it takes place naturally. No discussion of rules and so on. Yes, yes. Anybody else? But this is not no. Yes. What did you learn about learning and acquiring?
Which okay. Yes. We talk about learning when it has to do with learning of a second language and acquisition of the first language.
Another characteristic or something else.
When we say learning, we talk about learning a language in a formal context.
Context.
It can
Acquisition and consciously.
Yes, and acquisition, learning, acquiring a language unconsciously, but not in formal context.
Okay, as much as please again what you said about rules.
Learning is learning about the rules of the language.
Explicit discussion
Yes.
and about the rules. But for acquisition, there is nothing such as that. Something else? Yes, Ibrahim?
For learning, when we are learning, we are aware of what we learn. Acquisition, most of the time is...
So you are only mentioning one aspect of learning. Okay? Yes, very good. Acquire a second language or usually, debatable. Okay, yes.
And when it comes to the example of immigrants, we are talking about implicit learning or implicit acquiring or explicit acquiring. Children learn implicitly. They don't ask questions or wonder about anything, but immigrants, they imitate, they pose questions, a lot of things come to their mind when they face
Conscious
that language.
analysis of the language going on. But for the child, it's unconscious. It takes now a different way. Okay?
Especially
This will help you remember what you have learned. Okay?
I think immigrants occur somewhere between acquisition and learning.
What is it?
Meaning that they are a little bit aware,
Consciousness, yes.
and
Awareness.
at the same time they are doing something as acquisition.
We are talking about what?
Immigrants.
Immigrants, yes.
Because we are discussing immigrants acquisition of language. They are acquiring, they are learning at the same time because they are exposing some characteristics that children use while acquiring their language.
Which type of acquisition?
I guess the answer for this question is what we call peripheral learning, or is to say we learn the second language, but unconsciously. For example, in the classroom through the posters, or for example, to certain phrases that the teacher articulates, we tend to acquire them unconsciously without paying attention, or the teacher himself pays attention to these sentences. That's what we call peripheral learning. That's again no, it's not explicit.
No, maybe that's place in the classroom context. This is something different.
That's
The
different.
same for because it's done.
Some time features.
What's the
Maybe
same for the
Why?
immigrants?
Why?
Peripheral learning takes place in the classroom.
Why
There is
not
no
on-
relation between classroom setting, peripheral learning, and immigrants.
No, peripheral learning doesn't have to do just with subject to behavior approach.
Exactly.
It has to do, there may be peripheral learning
Just
outside
be
the
careful.
classroom.
There is only one thing you have to be careful about. Never use learning when talking about outside the classroom. Never use learning outside of the classroom. Outside the classroom, in natural environments, and so on, we're talking about acquiring. You can have a child acquiring, this is a different way unconsciously, but for an adult acquiring a language, it's somewhat unconscious, but still acquiring. Okay? Because there is no discussion, really explicit discussion, teaching materials, all the stuff in the classroom. Okay, yes, that's fine.
And also in literature that is interchangeably, interclassing may make the difference between the two.
Can you repeat your point, please?
In literature, they are used interchangeably.
Before.
When interclassing, he made this distinction between the two processes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. So that's how the difference between the. Okay. Now, so this question here coming to this point analysis. So it's debatable. So it's a debate. That's why there are always issues. You can have somebody like you, inshallah, and then
Yes.
okay, you learn this data on the basis of data. So you start telling, yes, it's not applicable. We have people who are outside of the category of age, after 16, 17, yet they can learn or acquire a language. We can have both. Okay, we can have both acquiring and we can have learning. Okay, which means that this age or critical period is not really solid enough. There are some cases that substantiated, like the case of Jenny. That's like, for me the best data we can have for substantiating this critical period hypothesis, but outside of it, not a big evidence, not solid evidence.
But the majority of scholars agree with this hypothesis of critical period.
Yes,
It's
it's
majority,
not
but-
majority. How do you know
and
this
that's-
is majority? How do you know this is majority? Substantive?
No, I read it in the book.
It's people, researchers, so they say, yeah.
But
It's not
it's
majority.
that's why you have
It's a big point.
Yeah.
It's a big point. Okay. Accepted by many, I wouldn't say majority, but many scholars. Okay. But it is still debatable. Still debatable.
Yeah, it is debate.
Yeah, that's why we have this was started from four perspective, and it's still debatable.
And we have to bear in mind another thing. Critical period hypothesis is more solid in relation to acquiring the first language.
Yes, and it is mentioned here.
First languages. But when it gets up to second language or the other languages, it starts losing, okay, solidity and okay. Another one.
Okay, so while studying the cognitive domain, there are different factors to take into consideration. One of them is the literalization hypothesis. So, as the child matures into adulthood, the left hemispheres, which controls the intellectual or cognitive functions, becomes more dominant than the right hemisphere, which controls the emotional functions. So, this contributes to a tendency to overanalyze and to be too intellectually concerned on the task of second language learning. Means that the dominance of the left hemisphere contributes to a tendency to overanalyze and to be intellectually concerned on the task of second language learning. So, because of this dominance, adults are aware of their learning of a second language. So we have equilibration. So equilibration is related to the concept of equilibrium that Piaget talked about, and which claims that cognition develops as a process from moving from stage of doubt to stages of certainty and resolution. So this equilibrium may provide significant motivation for language acquisition. Means that when individuals, especially children, experience this case or this state of disequilibrium, there is a conflict or interaction between language and cognition in order to achieve the equilibrium. Finally, we have rote and meaningful learning. So I think rote learning takes place through repetition, imitation, mimicking, and so on. And meaningful learning takes place in context of meaningful communication. So Osibel said that people don't have to do rote and mechanistic learning. Rather, most items should be acquired by meaningful learning. Okay, so the last factor or considerations is the affective considerations. So when we talk about affective considerations, it is worth to mention that there has been a set of studies in order to discover whether or not there is in the affective side of human beings some explanations to the acquisition of language. So in this regard, the role of egocentricity in human development is very important. Very young children are highly egocentric. Means that children cannot distinguish between their identity, their entity, and the world around them. And for example, if a child holds a pen in his hand, he thinks that this pen is a part of his body. He may consider it like, for example, his finger or something like that. Yes. Okay, so however, in pre-adolescence, children develop an acute consciousness of themselves as separate and identifiable entities, but ones which need protection. So here there is a development of inhibitions about the self-identity that adults or children in the pre-adolescence phase develop. Means that even if they are aware of or they can distinguish between themselves and the world around, they are still dependent on others, especially on adults. So according to Alexander Guerra, for any monolingual person, the language ego involves the interaction of the native language and ego development. Okay, so the language ego is a principle or a concept proposed by Alexander Guerra, and which claims that the language that a person speaks has a crucial role in determining his identity. Okay, means that through the use of language in sending and receiving messages, these messages are translated into ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions, which by the end determine the personality of or the identity of the person. Guerra suggested that language ego may account for the difficulties that adults have in learning a second language. A new language does not pose a threat or inhibition to the ego of child or of children. This is because the ego of child is still growing, flexible, as long as there are no sociocultural factors like such negative attitudes toward language or a group of language. So in that we can see that younger children are less frightened because they are less aware of language forms, and the possibility of making mistakes in those forms does not concern them greatly, but mature adults manifest a number of inhibitions. So this is another advantage that learners have in the acquisition of language in comparison to adult learners. The role of attitude is another important factor. So younger children are more likely to succeed in learning other languages because they don't have negative attitudes toward the races or cultures yet. Finally, we have peer pressure. So children are harsher critics of one another's action and words, which leads them to acquire a second language more successfully than adults. And thank you, and I leave the floor for my classmates.